your moderator today. Again, my name is Marcelina Trevino. I am the Director of Enforcement at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. With me today, I have some staff who will be monitoring the microphones at the end of the sessions for comments and questions. We have Sabrina Bombi and Elrita Price, if you could just, thank you. How this will work this afternoon is I will do a brief introduction of our 4 panelists. Then at that time, each one will take 5 to 7 minutes to give an overview. Once that overview is completed, I will have some questions for the panelists to answer. What I ask of you as the audience members is to think about the discussion and look for observations and suggestions as we look to move forward into policy reform and potential improvements in our system. With that, I would like to begin with introducing each of the panelists. First, I'd like to introduce John C. Campbell. He is the Director of the Investigations and Inspections Division for the Bureau of Professional Licensing at the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, also known as LARA. John holds a master's degree in organizational management from Spring Arbor University and a bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, in public administration from Siena Heights University. He's also a graduate of the Northwest University School of Police Staff and Command. John served as a police officer and deputy sheriff for 34 years prior to his employment with the state of Michigan. Next, I'd like to introduce Kim Trent. She's the Deputy Director for Prosperity for the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, also known as LEO. In her role, Kim is charged with guiding and building support for efforts to boost the economic security of Michigan citizens through policy, strategic initiatives, programs, and partnerships. Also in her role, she serves as the key staffer to the Michigan Poverty Task Force. She leads the department's Prosperity Division, which includes the Michigan High-Speed Internet Office, Office of Global Michigan, Michigan Women's Commission, Michigan Community Service Commission, Michigan STEM Council, and Black Leadership Advisory Council. She also serves as LEO's Equity and Inclusion Officer. Kim holds a bachelor's degree and master's degree from Wayne State University and also completed graduate studies at the University of Cape Town in Cape Town, South Africa. Next, I'd like to introduce Parker Fisher. He serves as the Legislative Liaison and the Tribal Liaison for the Michigan Department of Insurance and Financial Services, also known as DIFS. In his role, he is responsible for analyzing legislation and engaging with Michigan lawmakers on issues impacting various industries that DIFS regulates. He also represents the department on matters that pertain to Michigan's 12 federally recognized tribes. Parker is the vice chair of the East Lansing Housing Commission, which advises local leaders on matters pertaining to housing in the city. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Michigan. Next, Haywood Edwards is the inclusion specialist at the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, also known as MISHDA. In addition, Haywood has a Bachelor of Arts degree in finance from Morehouse College and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Michigan, Flint. With that, I'd like to introduce and welcome our panelists this afternoon. So now we will begin with John Campbell to start out in his 5 to 7 minute presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. John Campbell speaking, and I just wanted to give an overview of a quick overview of the Bureau of Professional Licensing at LARA. Many people probably don't know what we do, and I bring greetings from Dr. Marlon Brown, our director, our Chief Operating Officer, Courtney Pendleton, and our Chief Legal Officer, Adam Sandoval. The Bureau employs about 185 employees, and we license over 800,000 licensees in the state of Michigan, covering 27 health professions and 13 occupational code professions. The occupational code professions that we're interested in talking about today obviously are real estate appraisers, real estate agents and brokers, and then also property management companies, which fall under our regulation at the Bureau. In my particular division, we have three divisions: the licensing division, investigation inspections, which I lead, and then also the enforcement division, which is like our internal prosecutor. I have five sections in my area. I have complaint intake, 18 health investigators under 2 managers. Then I have 10 occupational code investigators under 1 manager. So in calendar year 2023, we opened about 6,000 files. Most of those were comprised of health complaints against health professionals because proportionately we licensed more of them. However, we did also have several complaints in the occupational code area, including the professions that I discussed. And I think one that we'll focus on predominantly today is real estate appraisers. So in closing of my remarks, we do cooperate with other state, federal, and local agencies. That's something that, since I've taken over, we've introduced where we share information more readily rather than making our sister agencies across the state file FOIA requests to get information, which I think is ridiculous. We're here to serve the public, and so to the extent that I can cooperate with DIFS, with LEO, and every other department in the state, I think that only serves our citizens better. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll move on to Kim Trent, please.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be here in my hometown of Detroit. It's nice to see all of these wonderful faces and learn from you what the work that you're doing. I am the, as mentioned, Deputy Director for Prosperity in Leon. I think it's a pretty cool title, I have to say, but it is, the danger of it is then you're really obligated to try to make the state more prosperous, and that is a goal that I take very seriously. My great-grandparents came to Michigan. My father's grandparents came to Michigan in 1913. My great-grandfather worked for Ford Motor Company, and you know, they had all of the accoutrement that everybody in the middle class in Michigan in the 20th century had. They had the cabin up north, and they were able to send their kids to college because they had good jobs. My great-grandfather had a good job. But we know that over the arc of the remainder of the 20th century, those kind of opportunities started to become a lot less available. And so we are at a point in our history as a state where we are working very feverishly to try to pivot. We are a state that was overly reliant on the auto industry. That's still, we're in the building that used to be UAW, as some of you may know. It used to be the office building for the UAW. So that heritage is not something we're walking away from. But we recognize that in order for us to succeed in the 21st century, we certainly need to have different kinds of jobs. And most importantly, we need to have a workforce that is trained for 21st century jobs. And so a lot of the work that we do in LEO is about barrier removal, trying to make sure that we are working collaboratively with other departments in the state of Michigan so that people who want to get the training that's necessary for them to have the kind of middle-class existence that my great-grandparents were able to have access to those opportunities. So in the Prosperity Division, you mentioned several of the divisions that are part of it, but one of the things that is most important to me in my work is being the key staffer to the Poverty Task Force, which was convened by Governor Whitmer in 2019. At the end of 2019, I came aboard in January of 2020, and since then we've issued 2 reports, one in 2021, one in 2022. The one in 2021 really focused on how the state deploys its benefits. And one of the things that we were able to get in that report, we asked for money to work with a third party to come in and really do an analysis of Michigan's TANF program. And that report is actually hot off the presses. We're going to be releasing it just in a matter of days. And spoiler alert, what it showed was that we don't deploy our dollars in a way that really help the people who need those dollars the most. And so a big part of what we do with LEO and with the Poverty Task Force is really examine where we are, how we can get our, in the measure that we use when we're looking at how we're trying to improve prosperity through the Poverty Task Force is the ALICE rate. And ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And it's a metric that was created by the United Way. And they just came out with their most recent report just a matter of weeks ago, and it showed that we actually ticked up as it relates to ALICE. ALICE is essentially the working poor. So these are people who go to work every day, but want to have for their family, the things that we all want. They want good housing. They want education. They want solid education. They want access to food and shelter and clothing and all of the things that make for a good life. And transportation is another important thing that we grapple with a lot with the Poverty Task Force. So we have worked really closely with 14 State Department directors at the table because we thought the governor thought it was important to break down silos. I think in the past with our anti-poverty work as a state really was centered in the Department of Health and Human Services. And of course, they still have a lot of the work that we do as a state. And maybe my department also, the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity is part of it because we have the Unemployment Insurance Agency, we have the Labor Division, which has things like the Wage and Hour Division, and they work with our organized labor and other, and things like paid leave, those kind of policies are centered in LEO. So we have a lot of the work, and so does DHHS, but we really believe that every department in state government should have a role in addressing poverty. And so we have at the table the Department of Corrections, so that we're looking at how justice-involved individuals how we can knock down barriers that they face to success. We are dealing with the Department of Transportation because when I think about the 3 issues that I hear about the most as the chief staffer to the Michigan Poverty Task Force, they are undoubtedly, the first one is housing. Just everywhere I go, I don't care what the topic is, housing always comes up. And housing is so connected to, when we talk about health and wealth, housing is intimately connected to both of those things. Because if you don't have access to quality housing, your health is going to suffer. We all know that. And if you don't, and it is the #1 way that people build wealth in our country. But it has remained outside of, my great-grandparents were able to easily afford a house. That's not necessarily true of their progeny of this generation. It's more difficult. Home ownership is more difficult. The access to affordable housing is limited. And so for the first time in the state's history, our department, MSHDA, and I think I'll be hearing this from my colleague here, but MSHDA embarked on a statewide housing plan with the idea that we need to go into communities and talk to the people on the ground about the housing needs that they have. So that is a huge part of our work with the Poverty Task Force. We are working very closely with MSHDA to make sure that housing is something that gets handled. So I mentioned housing as one of the issues that's really important. Also transportation. People who don't have access to transportation often have barriers with being able to find good jobs or even to complete school. We talk about how important it is for people to get those post-secondary credentials. That's very difficult to do if you can't get to locations. And although we do have more educational options that are online, not all of them are. Particularly when we're talking about things like skilled trades. Those are things where you have to be on site a lot of times. So that transportation and housing, and then childcare is something that's incredibly important and a terrible barrier for those who are trying to really succeed in this economy. We have fewer women who went back to work after COVID because of the lack of affordable and accessible childcare. So that's something that the governor has been laser focused, and the legislature have been laser focused on addressing and really trying to be creative. And one thing I'll just lift up when I talk about creativity is the Michigan Tri-Share childcare program, which is a program where employers are able to pay for 1/3 of one of their employees' childcare costs. So it's split in thirds. the employer pays a third, the employee pays a third, and the state of Michigan kicks in a third. We believe that this is a really innovative, and actually several states have now followed Michigan with that program. So innovation and knocking down barriers are really kind of the purview of our work with the Property Task Force, and we're really excited to hear from you about your suggestions and your lived experience when we talk about housing, because that's a very important part of the work that we do.
Thank you, Kim. And we have some follow-up questions for you, talking about those barriers and the innovation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to pass it along to Parker Fisher.
Hello, this is Parker speaking. I just first want to thank the Michigan Department of Civil Rights for hosting this really important conversation today. I think there are so many tie-ins with all the state departments here, and it's really, really good to have everyone here at the table. So, as mentioned, my name is Parker Fisher. I am the legislative liaison for the Department of Insurance and Financial Services. So what I do is kind of work on the policy side and legislative side of things, and work with our legislative stakeholders and other stakeholders to make sure that we have good policy and protect Michigan consumers. So a little bit about the department. Our mission is to ensure access to safe and secure insurance and financial services, fundamental for the opportunity, security, and success of Michigan residents, while also fostering economic growth and sustainability in both industries. The entities that we regulate include lenders such as banks, credit unions, mortgage lenders, and other consumer finance entities, as well as insurance companies and agents. And I think it's really important to the conversation on fair housing is how all these things on the financial services side kind of intersect with housing access. So, you know, if you're interested in starting a family or a business, you need to think about your insurance needs, your business insurance needs, health insurance, and also on the mortgage side, getting access to credit, lending. So I think that's where our department kind of intersects in the space of fair housing. So we are committed to ensuring that Michiganders are protected from discrimination in the industries that we regulate, and that includes the mortgage industry. Under state and federal law, Michiganders seeking mortgages are protected from discrimination based on factors like religion, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, among other factors. And it is our role to help ensure that the lenders we regulate are following those laws. Also, I really hope to touch on other programs that we have today that also help with access to financial services. And that can help people not only access mortgages and lending, but also hopefully home and housing. So I am looking forward to sharing more of that information during our discussion today. Thank you.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you, Parker. Yes, we have some follow-up because as we're talking about fair housing and access and barriers, it's also important to know when we get into the lending and mortgages. So thank you for that. I am now going to turn it over to Haywood. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Haywood Edwards, Michigan State Housing Development Authority. I'll begin my statements by saying what I said in the last session that I attended, was that many government policies have historically harmed marginalized populations by preventing and limiting access to housing, which we understand to be a pillar of attaining generational wealth. At MSHDA, federal tax credit dollars are the single largest source of funding to create and to rehab affordable housing. So part of what we do at MSHDA, we have to put together a plan for how we allocate those tax credit dollars that we receive. It's called the Qualified Allocation Plan, the QAP. So that plan lays out to where those dollars are going to go. And course, we've done this for a number of years. In 2022, we actually completed something called a racial equity impact analysis assessment, the RIA. If you haven't done the research or understand what that is, it was a monumental effort on our behalf to look at our allocations of the past and to understand who may have been unintentionally or otherwise harmed or prevented from having access to housing. And so completing this RIA, along with our internal efforts to educate our staff to make sure that they, first of all, understand what fair housing is, that when it comes time to create and implement policy and to build programs, we want to make sure that our MSHDA staff is trained and knowledgeable about what needs to be done. Today is a huge step toward doing that. So I'm grateful to be a part of this panel. I look forward to spirited dialogue and some challenging questions from you all as well. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you for that. So let's get into some of the discussion about access and policy issues as it pertains to housing, fair housing. The first question I have is for John. As it relates to discrimination, does LARA, Bureau of Professional Licensing, receive complaints about discrimination pertaining to other professions that are not related to housing?
The answer is, John Campbell speaking, the answer is yes. I won't spend a lot of time on that because obviously our focus is housing here today, but we do get a lot of complaints on medical professionals. A lot of times we're not able to do much with those complaints, but I turn over investigative materials to other state agencies, including this agency, to make sure that questions are addressed. In relationship to some of the occupational code that I was discussing earlier, the real estate appraisers, the governor had mandated that all of the boards, which are appointed by the governor, undergo training in implicit bias. All of the employees are required to have that training. All of our boards are required to have that training. What we've found over time, that's not enough. That just is not enough. And the amount of time that's dedicated to that is not enough. So as we get into this discussion a little later, I'll talk about some of the rules that our various boards are considering in terms of real estate appraisers and that type of thing to ensure that we offer much more in-depth training, and hopefully that the licensees will walk away with a better understanding and hopefully not commit violations.
This is Marcelina. Thank you. And as you speak of that, I ask the audience to think of other solutions to bring to the table at the end of this discussion as well. But now then, let's just jump in, John, as it relates to housing. You've indicated that the Bureau of Professional Licensing licenses and regulates the real estate appraisers, real estate brokers, and agents in property management. Has the Bureau of Licensing Professionals received complaints of discrimination involved in any of these professions? And as you mentioned earlier, how do you share that information with the agencies?
Yes, John speaking. Yes, we have received complaints. They're few and far between, but the real estate appraiser area is the one that we've received the most complaints in. We've also received complaints regarding real estate agents where individuals have complained to us, and we understand that they literally had to sanitize their house in order to get a better appraisal or get a real estate agent willing to show that house. And those are areas that we really believe need to be addressed. As it stands right now, we're limited on what we can enforce to the Michigan Occupational Code and and then obviously the associated rules that the various boards pass. And then for real estate appraisers, there is a section called USPAP, that's like a federal, those are federal requirements, and that's the Uniform Standard of Professional Appraisal Practices. And over time, those have offered very little training in the area of bias when it comes to conducting appraisals, showing properties, and for property management companies, individuals that hold a broker's license and manage properties. I toured around the state and went to the public hearings, and one thing that became very clear to me is that this is real, it is happening out in the communities, and it is something that needs to be addressed at our level. So that is the message that I've taken back to our leadership. That's the message I've taken back to our various boards. And again, in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the training that's required in those areas.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you. My follow-up then is going to be for Kim. In your opinion, we've heard about training and some of the barriers, but in your opinion and from your perspective, what are some of the most crucial barriers to housing stability for Michiganders?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of my work revolves around the poverty task force. So when a lot of how I look at my lens for this work is through the lens of someone who's engaged in that work. And certainly affordability is a huge barrier to housing stability and just the lack of housing in general. We have a really old housing stock in our state. Some of it is not habitable. It costs money to get it up to code and get people into homes. And although you might look around and say, well, we have a lot of empty homes, why can't we fix those up? There are a lot of barriers to that work. We have too many Michiganders who fall below the poverty line, and our housing burden, according to the 2024 ALICE report that just came out, as I mentioned, 67% of Michigan households who are in the ALICE population are rent burdened, which means that they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And 38% are severely rent burdened. So, there's clearly a disconnect there. And then when you layer on top of poverty, discrimination, which is also an issue, and why we're here today, it makes it even more difficult. And so when we talk about discrimination, when we talk about who is poor in our state, people of color are more likely to be poor in our state. Women are more likely to be poor in our state. So, all of the discrimination that they face just in getting property in the first place. In addition to that, they're also struggling with lack of resources, of financial resources. So, and we know that because of that lack of those housing options, we're paying a cost as it relates to our mental health. There are a lot of different consequences of that. And so we are working, I mentioned that the Poverty Task Force is composed of 14 different state departments, because we have to look at it in a way that's multidimensional, because it is a multidimensional problem. And one thing that I'm really excited about when I look at MSHDA, I mentioned that I am the Equity and Inclusion Officer for LEO. And one thing that I'm excited about looking at MSHDA is that they have a whole division in in MSHDA that deals with discriminatory, trying to abate discriminatory practices. Not only that, but really both within the department and in the work that they do in the community. And I just think that that's important. I think that the governor set the tone at the top of, in her role to ensure, as was mentioned before, that people are getting training to acknowledge that they have biases. We all have them. It's how we, navigate around them. So just the first step, I think, to addressing the barriers to housing stability is really doing a genuine assessment of where we are and why we are where we are. Because until we really do that, and that's part of what happened with the housing plan, the statewide housing plan, now it's just a matter of implementing it and making sure that we're continuing to talk to people with lived experiences. So it's not just these, lovely bureaucrats like us who are making decisions, but the people who really have the need are letting us know what works best for them.
Mrs. Marcelino, thank you. And you mentioned MSHDA and the work that they do as it pertains to discrimination. So I'm going to jump to Haywood. MSHDA is actively working to address discriminatory housing policies from the past, and you mentioned that in your opening remarks. How is MSHDA working to address these policies, and how can MSHDA adapt the current policies to reflect a commitment of true change?
Thank you. Excellent question. I believe that, in referencing Kim's remarks, is that as we work to put together policy solutions, we have to make sure that we have everyone at the table. And that sounds, kind of terminology, the words that we use in DEI when we talk about inclusion. But we really have to do the work. And what that entails sometimes when we are looking to get feedback, we have to translate documents to other languages. We have to actually go out into the community for those who may not have online access to scan a code to answer a survey. We actually have to partner with agencies that work with our homeless population who can physically hand someone a form. And so it's not quick, it's not easy, but it's necessary as we work to put together actual policy solutions that will work. We don't want to just check a box. We don't want to just say, well, we came up with this policy and let's just see if it will work. Much of the work with the statewide housing plan that Kim also referenced, it began with MSHDA as we led the charge to make that plan happen. And so after all of that work and the research that we've done, and one thing that really we heard from you all is that people want solutions that are delivered regionally, because every neighborhood, every region may have some differences. And so because of the statewide housing plan, the state has been divided into 15 regional housing partnerships with lead agencies that are working with governments and nonprofits and developers and businesses and grassroots organizations. And so I want to make sure that today, before you leave here, make sure you know who the lead agencies are in your area. If you are advocating for a population, make sure that the people that you are advocating for, make sure that their voices are heard as these lead agencies bring then those concerns back to the table. So it's very important that we talk about policy, true policy, inclusive policy, policy that brings the entire family together at the table. We have to think, and I referenced this in my last panel, is that we have to start with the ones we may have forgot, the ones with lived experience. You'd be surprised how often we get in the room, we talk about addressing the homeless issue, the homeless problem, the homeless pandemic, and we never ask someone who's been homeless before whether or not this solution that we're proposing would work. And so, in summary, what I would say as we talk about policy, I'm grateful that this event today was done with arms outstretched. If you look across the agenda, all the state agencies that came together today, like I'm overwhelmed when I look down the list and see that we've got Kim Trent here, we've got people from all over Michigan, and I'm honored to be a part of this. And so make sure today is my charge to you today before I pass this on. Make sure that you know who the lead agencies are in your region, and make sure you're connected with them, you know when they're meeting, and you know how to deliver your feedback to them.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you for that. And what we've heard, I think, so far is that fair housing stretches. We've talked about poverty and access and some barriers. And I want to circle back to you, Parker. Talking about mortgage loans, it's obviously critical to the home buying process of having mortgages. What rights should Michiganders be aware of when it comes to lending during the home buying process? And I'll have a follow-up for you after that.
Okay, certainly. So this is Parker speaking. So I kind of want to echo some of the comments made by the other panelists so far, and I think discrimination is a big issue, but it's also important to understand how the law protects you against discrimination, especially in the lending space, which is something that our department is charged with protecting consumers against potential discrimination. So under state and federal law, as I mentioned earlier, Michiganders are protected from discrimination based on factors like religion, race, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and among other things. But it's important to understand that discrimination can look different in different ways, and it can take different forms. So I think we're pretty familiar with the idea of just discrimination on its face. So overt discrimination would be denying someone a loan or a mortgage based on any of those prohibited factors. But there are other examples of discrimination that people should be aware of, such as comparative evidence of disparate treatment or disparate impact. And so something like that would look like when a lender doesn't outright refuse to lend based on a prohibited factor, but might use those factors in different standards to different borrowers. So that could be requiring a higher down payment for someone or applying a higher interest rate based on one of those factors. And it could also look like an example of where a neutral policy on its face may not target any single group in particular, but has the effect of discriminating against a certain group. So, and that encompasses any of those factors like race, gender, where you may not always be able to spot it right away, but it is something that we look for in our routine examinations of our mortgage lenders. What we do during those examination processes is that we review all the denied mortgages, all the loans, and make sure that the standards and processes they've used to come to those determinations are following the law. And another tool that we use to dig deeper into concerns is our consumer complaint process. So I'll probably say this a couple times today, but one of the things that you can do is you can call our department and file a complaint if you feel like you've been discriminated against. And those complaints are reviewed very carefully.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you. So we know that the public, Michiganders, can file unlawful discrimination complaints with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. But you touched on a couple things talking about disparate impacts. What can we do potentially as partners or just in your agency? What can people do when they feel that they've been discriminated against? Because you talked about kind of the data analysis and things. And sometimes that's difficult for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights when we are looking at complaints like that. So if you could address that.
Right. So I kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'm kind of leading into the next question. So, so our department is here to protect Michiganders from discrimination. And while we can monitor concerns through our regulatory functions like examinations, the best way we can dig deeper is through those individualized consumer complaints. So on the examination side, that's more where we see it from the industry-facing side. You know, we review all their policies with them, their procedures, and they report to us how they're in compliance with the law. But we don't always see the consumer-facing side. So when you call us and ask for our help, we're able to take your information that you've seen from your perspective and kind of try to make sure everyone is in compliance with the law and make sure that if there's any discrimination going on, that we can track that pattern and bring those data points together to try to see if they are having any policies that do impact and disparate impact or other things where they're having certain groups being treated differently.
Thank you. This is Marcelina speaking. So now, John, I'm going to circle back to you. Has there been any discussion at the Bureau, Department, or Board level regarding discrimination as it pertains to housing and people seeking housing in the state of Michigan, from your perspective and your role?
This is John speaking. Yes, the answer is yes. We've identified that as a huge issue, and I'm going to run through some training requirements that are going to be implemented in the area of, and again, when I went to the public hearings, one of the biggest concerns I heard was issues surrounding appraisal of property. And so I'll address that one first, but we interact with, in addition to our boards, we interact with the trade organizations and the federal government. We get audited by the federal government, in fact, when it comes to our enforcement of the appraisal profession. So through the federal government, they have what is called the Appraisal Qualifications Board, and that's a committee of the Appraisal Foundation at the federal level, and I'll call it the AQB from now on because that's what it's referred to as. They have mandated essentially that beginning in January of 2026, so January 1 of 2026, a course pertaining to valuation bias, fair housing law, and regulations that meets the content requirements of AQB has to be implemented. The course shall meet the following length requirements. So again, looking back to the government or the governor's mandate that our boards have implicit bias training, in most cases that was about an hour or so. What is coming in 2026, and the reason it's put out that long is so that these curriculum can be developed, but the course that each appraiser will be required to take is a 7-hour course. So, and in that 7-hour course, and I'm not going to run through each of them, but I've highlighted a few that they are required to cover: valuation bias case studies, understanding real estate bias, the historical context, the role following real estate agents, insurance appraisers, lenders, government-sponsored enterprises, federal, state, and local agencies and legislation, court rulings, public conversations regarding bias. And that's something, to reflect on something Haywood said, we're not the smartest people in the room always. The people that go through it are the smarter people. Those are the people we should be talking to. And then there's just a number of others, and components of valuation bias, not only explicit, but implicit and structural as well. And then they'll have case studies that they have to go through. So the 7-hour course initially, and then for every relicensing cycle after that, there'll be a 4-hour course that will be required. So that will be on top of the existing training requirement that's in place for the implicit bias. And our real estate appraiser board is very supportive of this because, again, it's identified. They hear complaints about it, we hear complaints about it, and then subsequently forward them on to other state agencies and follow up. As far as real estate agents and brokers, right now they're required to have 3 hours of training in, they call it legal, and now it's mandated that 1 hour of that be dedicated to issues of bias and that type of thing. But my belief is once that this is implemented with the appraiser industry, I believe that we may be able to take that across some of our other professions as well. And one might ask, how do we track that training? How do we know that individuals are completing the training that they're required to get? We have a section in our bureau that conducts audits. So we'll pull a certain number of licensees every year from every profession that we license, and they get audited based on their training. And their license could be subject to disciplinary action or suspension if they're not completing the required training or the required follow-up training. So we believe that we have a pretty good handle on it at this point. Again, I'm a little disappointed that it's out there in the future, but but we're already paying attention to it and hope to get this implemented across the board.
Thank you. This is Marcelina speaking. Just in a follow-up to that, with the licensing and the training that you just spoke about, does the Bureau of Professional Licensing cooperate and interact with other state agents and federal agencies related to allegations of discrimination? And I ask that because it's one thing to actually provide the training, but to evaluate to see if it's working, if there are improvements, and when there aren't and are allegations. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This is John speaking. So when we do receive an allegation, especially in those professions that I've referenced, we do investigate that, and if it doesn't rise to a violation of the current statute or rules, what we have done since I've taken over is we begin to refer those to other agencies. I think what happened in the past, and not to criticize the previous department administration, but a lot of times the complaint would simply be closed, and then if a complainant called and inquired about what happened with their complaint, they'd say, well, we don't have jurisdiction over that, but call the Department of Civil Rights, they might help you out. Every quarter when I do training with my employees, I remind them of something that I believe is very, very important, and I think a lot of state employees need to remember this from time to time. When a citizen reaches out to state government, no matter what department it is, it's probably their first contact with state government. They don't know if they're calling the right place. Again, we get a lot of complaints that are aimed at DIFs or LEO. And so what we've instructed our staff to do, rather than saying, well, that's not our area, you'll have to call so-and-so, or, consult, go online and look and that type of thing, we provide resources for other departments now. And with the completed investigations, we forward those to these other departments so that they have the background material. So those are some of the areas that we're addressing that.
Thank you. This is Marcelina speaking. I'm going to circle back before we get into hearing what your agencies are doing moving forward with initiatives. But Haywood, this question is really for you, and it's two-pronged. MSHDA seeks, and you talked a little bit about this, that you seek input from Michiganders as they work to combat discrimination. And I know you're embracing inclusion at MSHDA and trying to expand services in that way. How can people, the public, the audience today provide feedback that is listened to and taken seriously? And what resources has MSHDA allocated for specifically fair housing?
Very good question. Haywood Edwards. I believe that what I referenced earlier about the feedback is so important, and I will give the web address, michigan.gov/housing plan. There you can go look at the statewide housing plan. Also, you can access the map that shows the state of Michigan and how we broke it down. So that's michigan.gov/housing plan. And so with that, we want to make sure, again, that you know which lead agency in your area is bringing those concerns back to the table. But also, with all of our programs and policies, we have embraced a different way of doing things. We have, at MSHDA, an Office of Equity and Inclusion. And we've been tasked with looking at not just externally and working with efforts as far as fair housing and so on, but internally. And so what we are in the process of putting together, believe it or not, our first DEI plan. And I pause after that because sometimes people say, well, that's the first one ever. And so what we are doing is engaging in intentional activities to make programs more equitable, make sure that our policies are more accessible. And some of those examples are modifications to our programming to increase the number of accessible units financed through MSHDA, requiring our partners to take fair housing training, making sure that our materials, that everything that we put out, that we run an accessibility check to make sure that it can be read by all. That's a much larger project than it probably seems. that when every program document and booklet as it goes out, we have to make sure, we have to look at every table, every chart to make sure that it's readable. It's a huge project. We have some people working at MSHDA who make sure that that happens, like my coworker Stephanie Oles, who works, makes sure every time she sees something, she makes sure that it's accessible. But that's what we need. We need people who are guardians of the gate, who are determined to make sure that everything in their purview is fair and it's equitable. And if it's not, to come forward with solutions. A good friend of mine, a mentor of mine, and I'll end my statement with this, he said, there's a way to live life that when you see someone's problem, and he gave an example of someone sitting in a room, sitting in darkness. He said, what you should never do is curse someone's darkness without lighting a candle. And so it's a way that we should approach policy solution. We can talk all day about what's wrong, but I believe we have some of the most intelligent, compassionate, creative people that are working on this issue, that if we can look within and look without, ask those who've been forgotten, I think that we can come up with some policy solutions that in the future we can look back to this day and say, wow, we really did a lot of work after that day.
This is Marcelina speaking. Absolutely. And as you talk about DEI and the importance of accessibility, I think it's also important to do some of that cross-agency work, because there are agencies that have DEI policies and procedures implemented, and there's things that agencies haven't thought about that other agencies are doing that is innovative. And so I look forward to that cross-agency work in those particular areas, especially as it pertains to fair housing and other services that the state offers. Thank you for that. And I'm going to move into then really what our agencies individually are doing in some future programs and initiatives. So Kim, I'm going to circle to you, if that's okay. Are there any exciting LEO-led programs or initiatives that are on the horizon that you believe will help the state overcome some of these fair housing challenges and other challenges that you've heard today?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about, so I mentioned we've had 2 reports. I'm sorry, this is Kim. Keep forgetting to do that. I apologize. So we talked a little bit about the Poverty Task Force and the 2 reports that we issued, and we have another one that's coming out this year. We also have another report that you'll see in the next couple of weeks, as I mentioned, that analyzes our TANF dollars and how we deploy them. I believe that we are at a turning point, and one of my major goals with the Poverty Task Force is to help redefine how people perceive low-income Michiganders. Because there are people who think it's just an urban problem. There are people who have, because of their racial biases, think that it's just a problem for people of color. Specifically, there has, for the last 40 years or so, been a conscious effort to define poverty as a problem of Black women. And we know that the poorest counties in our state are rural counties. So one of the things that we're doing at LEO and with the Poverty Task Force and my division, Prosperity, we have the Office of Rural Prosperity. So they're on the ground working with communities throughout the state of Michigan and talking to them about what their needs are, because every community has different needs. We can't come in as state government and tell people what their problems are. So for example, in Traverse City, which is a prosperous city, but the people who make Traverse City work, the people who were working in those tourist stores, the casino, those kind of places, they can't afford to live in Traverse City. And they don't have transportation in Traverse City. So that's when the state can step in and say, we need to have an approach. We need to work with people on the ground to figure out how we can, A, get more housing on the ground in Traverse City that people can afford, that people who are working in Traverse City can actually afford to live in. But then it's multidimensional. It's also a transportation issue. It's also an education issue because ultimately, you know, we want people to work, but our goal at Leo, and we've really been very intentional about saying this, is not just jobs, but good jobs. We think it's important for people to have prosperity and to not have to work, stack 2 and 3 jobs in order to barely make a living. So, you know, when we talk, one of the things that we've also, this department actually was recently moved to the new Miley Department of State Government, but it started off in Leo when we talked about the 60 by 30 initiative, trying to get at least 60% of working Michiganders to have that post-secondary credential. Those are the kind of future thinking ideas that are really going to be necessary when we talk about repopulating Michigan. We need to really focus on how do we improve the quality of life for most Michiganders. And we do that by making sure that they have access to good jobs and that their communities have access to affordable housing. That's a really high priority for us. And I should mention, I keep kind of pivoting to Misha because Misha is actually part of Leo. So we take all of their successes as ours as Leo, but none of the failures, not that you have any. But we are, you know, really intentional, though. I think intentionality is a huge part of this work, not just saying it'll work itself out, which I think has, in some cases, been the posture of state government. It's about really, again, first, you know, as I mentioned with the TANF report, really doing a deep analysis. What are the problems? How is system change? Why is system change necessary? How do we get there? And then implementation. So I'm excited about our efforts. You know, all of this is connected. So when I talk about the Poverty Task Force having 14 state departments at the table, justice-involved individuals, for example, are discriminated against in housing often. So how do we address that? Well, the answer to that is an answer that includes the Department of Corrections, it includes MSHA, it includes DHHS, it includes our education department. There are a number, certainly the Michigan State Police, we have a program called Clean Slate where people who have a conviction, a lot of folks who are walking around thinking they have convictions right now don't even have them anymore because we have legislation that was adopted that has meant automatic expungements. The problem is, and this is where you have a disconnect a little bit in state government, even though we have automatic expungements, we can't reach out to that person to let them know that their offense has been expunged or their conviction has been expunged. So it really puts the onus on the person to look it up. So those are the kind of problems we're trying to solve all the time with the Poverty Task Force because we want people to know because they have barriers that don't even exist anymore, but they don't really have access to finding that out. So, you know, those are the kind of things when we talk about Poverty Task Force and kind of our multidimensional approach to lowering the state's poverty rate, we recognize all of those things are important and are interconnected. And so I'm excited about the fact that we do have that approach, we have that intentionality, we have that real commitment to collaboration. And I think that that's going to make a difference, and that is how we can really lower the incidence of, I mean, discrimination is part of our culture, but the state has an obligation to do all that we can to remove barriers for people who have faced discrimination in the past and in the present. I think too often, I think it's so important for us to have conversations about what happened in the past because it explains the current conditions, but we also have to be honest about what our current conditions are and the role that race and gender, sexual orientation, or whatever play in discriminatory actions in every field, including in housing. So I'm excited about the work that we're doing at Leo and the work that we're doing to bring other state departments to the table and solve some of these problems.
Mrs. Marcelino, thank you for that. And you know, you touched on the people that make the state work and operate, and you mentioned Traverse City. So you know, the seasonal, migrant and seasonal farm workers, and the access to fair housing is something too that I wanted to make note of, because they definitely make our state run and get us
Absolutely.
food.
That is a very good point.
But as we're going to close out for this session, but Parker, I'm going to turn it over to you because Kim talks about access to services, and I think the panel has as a whole. What other actions is DIFS taking to help Michiganders access financial services? And why is this important to fair housing?
Right, thank you. I think one of the programs that we're really happy to talk about is the Michigan Open Account Coalition, or MOAC for short. And what that program is to work with Michiganders to have them find certified low or no-cost bank or credit union accounts. So this is things, this includes things like fees, overdraft fees. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories where people have come to us and said, I got a bank account, but I got a fee here, and it can be really damaging for someone who doesn't have a lot coming in and relying on a steady income and to have something there in their bank account. And you know, this is reflected in the data too. You know, we know that not having access to financial resources and tools costs the unbanked and underbanked Michiganders an average of $3,000 a year in fees for cash checking, money orders, bill pay services, and other third-party debit cards. So a little bit about the Michigan Open Account Coalition is that this program helps connect the unbanked with those certified low-cost accounts at Michigan bank and credit unions. These standards follow the National Cities for Financial Empowerment certification standards, and they include standards for things like no overdraft fees, no account activation fees, closure, dormancy, inactivity, low balance fees. It also includes limits on ATM fees, limits on minimum opening deposits and monthly maintenance fees. And I think the best part is that there's no need to qualify for anything. They are available to the general public. So I think all those things have been traditional barriers for people getting access to bank accounts. And we know that the benefit of having a bank account is immense. You know, having a bank account allows you to keep more of your earnings, and we know that people save more money than those without bank accounts. And it also initiates that relationship with a financial institution. And that helps getting a mortgage or a loan easier, and starts the process of having people get housing and relates to the topic of fair housing. So we're really happy about that. And you can visit our website where we have a full list of all the participating bank and credit unions, so you can explore and open an account.
This is Marcelina speaking. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists. I think at this time, we'll open it up to some of your solutions that you've thought about, some comments and questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we have Sabrina here with the microphone and Elrita to my right, your left.
Hi, my name is Tara Brown, and I'm an organizer with Detroit Eviction Defense. I'm also a real estate licensee in the state of Michigan. I heard you all talking a lot about appraisal and fair housing. A problem that I've noticed that I've raised with the board, even as recently as Monday, you have agents and unlicensed property management companies operating. People like me report that to the state, to the Lara Division in Real Estate. And that is pretty much where the issue goes to die. There is a problem, and I'm so glad that you are here. There is a problem with people getting evicted by these bad actors after complaints have been filed, because the complaints have not been addressed in a timely fashion. I made a complaint against somebody 4 years ago during the pandemic. The Attorney General just started prosecuting them in February. I've made another complaint against another real estate agent last year. I just heard about a response from it this year, and that's only because the woman I complained about got prosecuted in February, and the Attorney General and the licensing board said, we take this very seriously. I told the news, no they don't. Look, I made this complaint. Something has to be done about these investigations getting done in a timely fashion. 4 years is not a timely fashion. If somebody gives you hard evidence that there are fair housing violations and people operating without licensing, you all have to be proactive and stop them right away. Because when you don't, it leads to people being evicted wrongfully. So that's a problem. The other problem is, I'm glad MSHDA and the Poverty Task Force is here. You all are going out asking the people with lived experience. Put them on the board and have them at the table. That's where you start. Don't go out to ask them. Have them sitting at the table next to you so they can tell you. And I do realize that the MSHDA board does have a person with lived experience on the board. He is not acting in the best interest of other people with lived experience. The other part of that, and I'm glad, Ms. Trent, that you're sitting here because I met you a couple years ago, reconnect. Part of what lifts people out of poverty is education. So maybe you all should be talking to Ms. Trent about getting the people who are living in low-income housing and abject poverty this free education that Michigan is giving. Thank you.
Okay,
Any
so
response?
Haywood Edwards, I appreciate your energy that you bring. Your concerns are what actually led to us creating an addition. So there's a statewide housing plan, there's a regional housing partnerships. And so we actually created, I think it's the equity, it's the EAC, but it's made up of people with lived experience. And they are a standing advisory board that brings their concern. They meet, they discuss concerns, and so it's not just, with the homeless population, but we also have, the rural and urban interest represented, as well as, so we actually went, and Brittany, who works in MSHDA, she helped to put together the team, looked at the applications to make sure that it was a diverse group of people. And so those concerns, and I think part of what happens is we're doing so much behind the scenes now. People don't know what it is that we're doing. And so although I was a former high school algebra teacher, there's one, people say my math ain't mathin' when I say this, but because 1 + 1 is what? Can somebody give me an answer? What's 1 + 1? But it's not, it's 3. And so I say that all the time because it's all about synergy, that the combined effort of us working together rather than each person working individually as one, there's an exponential effect to what happens when we work together. So what John mentioned about appraisers, we work with the fair housing centers who design fair housing training for appraisers that we can then send to you. You can send it out to the email list, and so you didn't have to even make a bump in your budget because we already do it. So those efforts are what we are going to embrace going forward. Thank you for that question. Okay, great.
This is John speaking. Tora, if you and I can talk afterwards, I'm very familiar with your complaints, and I can give you an update. I'm not gonna air them in public, but I think you'll like what I have to say. Thank you.
And if I could just respond, first of all, thank you for that remark. I attended the Building Michigan Communities Conference this year, and one of the things that I found, actually probably the thing that was the most important thing that I learned on the ground there, was a panel about people with lived experiences. And one of the things that they said, that one of the panelists said was, don't just put us on panels, pay us, because we're taking time out of our day. We're low income. We're taking time out of our day to let you know about what our lives are like and why your programs will or will not work. It's a job for us to do that. I mean, we face transportation barriers, all the barriers we talked about earlier. And that really did prick my consciousness a little bit. I thought, prick my conscience. I said conscience. Because I thought, we do have practitioners who are on the Poverty Task Force, but we really do need to have people who are affected by it on the task force, and we need to find some money to make sure that they're compensated for it. So that's something that I'm trying to work on to make sure that we have that in the next iteration of our report, that we really have that kind of inclusion. So thank you so much for raising that and reminding us that we have an obligation to not only seek the advice of people, but really see them as equal partners in this work.
Ms. Marcelina speaking, thank you. We have a question with Elrita.
My name is Donald Stuckey with the Michigan League for Public Policy. I want to piggyback on a statement that I heard earlier. There are some important pieces of legislation in the legislature that are moving forward that are really important. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on some of these. And for transparency's sake, I did ask some of this earlier, so Mr. Haywood probably knows what I'm going to ask about. But there's a bill in the legislature that addresses source of income, where people are being discriminated based on the source of income that they're using to pay for their housing needs. There's the Fair Chance Access to Housing Act, which is really important, making sure that people with that have a criminal history have access to housing, and the eviction record sealing and expungement legislation, so that people who have people who've had a eviction are able to get an expungement. Do you think that these kinds of laws are something that would be helpful in addressing discrimination? Because it seems to me that some of these things are just no-brainers, given the situation that we have in terms of the different types of discrimination. I think I heard earlier in an earlier session there was some discussion about how some of these things are used as proxies for racial discrimination, and so these are good ways to combat that. So I just want to get your thoughts on some of this.
So would love
Thank you.
someone, Marcelina speaking, someone, Kim?
This is Kim. I would just say those solutions, those policy solutions that you just mentioned, I definitely think we need to take a look at those kind of approaches, because one of the things that we have done that we advocated for in our first Poverty Task Force report was more housing choice vouchers for returning citizens. And what we found is landlords aren't taking us up on the offer. So the only thing that's really going to move the needle with that is strategies so that that information is either suppressed or, I mean, you know, with some safeguards, like there are certain people who are not, they should not have access to certain kinds of domiciles. However, when we make when someone is released from prison, the idea is we want them to succeed, right? So if we want them to succeed, housing is a key element of that. If you don't have housing, there are desperate decisions that you'll make that could land you back in the criminal justice system. So, you know, when we talk about, oh, we're trying to get more housing choice vouchers, and we did get more. That was a goal for us, but then we realized the vouchers are important, but you've got to have landlords who are willing to use them, and that's where we fall short. So the kind of solutions that you're talking about now that that help people, particularly people with addiction, now that there seems to be a national recognition that addiction is not a, you know, failing of someone's morality, that it's a disease and it's something that people can overcome and can move forward with their lives. Now that there seems to be more acceptance of that reality, and less criminalization of addiction, we also should not make it difficult for people to be able to move on as it relates to housing. So I definitely think those are ideas that are certainly worth more examination, you know, working together with the industry so that we have solutions that, I mean, but people who are landlords are probably not going to be happy with everything we do because we're course correcting. So yes, I can speak on behalf of myself and the Poverty Task Force. Those are the kind of ideas that we're mulling over now. And, you know, we don't openly, well, we have recommendations that we make. We can't go in and lobby for them. You know, we're part of state government. But we certainly have a voice, and we intend to use it to talk about the policy benefits of things like what you just described.
Thank you, Kim. We're going to take 2 more questions and wrap it up.
Hello, my name is Keyshawn Wade. I graduated from the last public high school in the city of Flint, and I went to Cornell afterwards. I currently study urban and regional planning with a concentration in inequality in urban life, as well as real estate, housing, and urban economics. This is a little up my wheelhouse. I'm here today because I gave testimony to the Michigan CRC on the need to have class be a protected class. And because we all know across all the designations, the people who suffer most, the people who are most vulnerable are those who are lower class, low income. In that effort, it is hard to find a way to protect class specifically. So some of my personal thoughts is that we need to decommodify housing in order to protect class and have people not face discrimination on the basis of class. And to do that, I think there are multiple avenues that we can take. There are multiple different strategies to employ. But really, I just want to speak about our economic culture and how extremely extractive it is. I think this is an amazing panel, and I think you guys are pulling from the far reaches of our bureaucracy. So I'll kind of point to different people that I'm talking about. Parker, I think something that could be done in terms of mortgages is looking at the amortization process of mortgages and looking at how specifically extractive it is for working class families to pay such big amounts of interest on their mortgages and not receive anything back for it. Next, I'll go to Haywood because I was actually a part of the effort to get the statewide housing plan out and get people to know about it. I'm part of Region 6. In MSHDA's housing plan, they have 8 priority areas, one of them being housing stock, one of them being goal 4.4, which is looking at alternative financing models for folks, looking at ways to make people able to afford housing. And I think that's something that we should really be looking at. Increasing access to no/low interest patient capital, you guys called it, or lending products, is a key tool in getting people able to fight our aging housing stock in the state of Michigan. Secondly, I'll go a little bit more on the renting side. If we bolstered community and collective ownership through converting existing and new developments into limited equity housing cooperatives, that will give low-income people an opportunity to steward and protect themselves economically and housing-wise in the will of their service. It would allow them to have equity in equity. They will be able to build equity, and it would be equitable access to equity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think we are out of time and wrap up, so I'd like to thank each and every one of the panelists today. I think there was a lot of information that was provided and received, and also I'm optimistic about the work that we can collaboratively do together and continue as it pertains to fair housing and other areas that we all are responsible for. So with that, thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions today.